Hello, my name's Elise Garrick, and I am the Vice President of IANA. As Brad so nicely said, that is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. The Internet Assigned Numbers Authority is one of the oldest Internet institutions. It was established in about 1970 through a collaboration between the U.S. government and the University of Southern California, and John Postel was the individual who filled that role for many, many years. And once the U.S. government moved away from developing this research project, which established the IP addresses on which the Internet is based today, it transitioned out of the role of running the IANA, and ICANN was established. ICANN is now the nonprofit organization which houses the IANA and the IANA functions, and the IP addresses are one of the three functions that are the role of the IANA itself. So we're a long-running part of the Internet, and the IPv4 and now the IPv6 addresses are part of our portfolio. So I'll turn it over to Axel, and he can then say what the relationship between IANA and the NRO is.
Very good. I shall do that. So yes, my name is Axel Pavlik. I'm the Managing Director of the RIPE NCC, and this year also the Chairman of the Number Resource Organization. Now the NRO, as we call it, is basically a loose cooperation body for the regional Internet registries, so that we talk with one voice and coordinate ourselves. And in the ICANN surroundings, we also perform the function of the address supporting organization. Now, going on to the RIRs, the regional Internet registries, there are 5 of us. We are all not-for-profits. The RIPE NCC that I'm chairing in a way is situated in Amsterdam. So our service region, for instance, is Europe, the Middle East, parts of Central Asia. There are 4 other regional Internet registries. There's ERIN for North America, LACNIC for Latin America and the Caribbean region, APNIC for the Asia-Pacific region, and AFRINIC for Africa. What our main business is as Internet registries is getting numbers from IANA, from Elise, and giving them out to people who need them, and that mostly is our members, Internet service providers, large corporations basically, who run the Internet, operate parts of the Internet. The RIRs have been established, excuse me, starting in 1992, and yeah, have been going around the world. Then AFRINIC is the youngest one. We allocate those numbers. We do a couple of other things, varies a little bit between the regions. For instance, we do one of the root name servers, do some measurements and the like. But the most visible thing is allocation of Internet number resources. That's IPv4 addresses, IPv6 addresses, and autonomous system numbers. So that's us.
Elise, bottom line, in the most simple of terms, what is IPv6 and why is it important?
If you think about the IP addresses, like you know telephone numbers, and IPv4 had a certain number of addresses, so that meant you could address a certain number of devices. And if you think of telephone numbers as an analogy for that, basically what you're saying is IPv4 is going to run out of numbers, so you can't have any more phone numbers. And that's what it's doing for computers and the systems that connect them for the Internet. So IPv4 is not going to have enough addresses for everyone who wants one. So basically, IPv4 has about 7 billion addresses, and there are the world has a population of 7 billion people. IPv4 has 3.7 addresses. So obviously, that would mean that not everyone in the world could have a phone number, if it were a phone number, not an IP address. IPv6 has enlarged the numbers that you can use for addressing devices. So that would be like having more telephone numbers available. And they've enlarged it to such an extent that you have 340 undecillions. I don't even know how to, describe an undecillion. It's so many zeros that it would take forever for us to run out of it, or maybe not forever, but a very long time.
What is the current status of IPv6 rollout or adoption, whatever the appropriate phrase is? What is the current status, and what's the very immediate future? Let me pose that to both of you.
It's not good enough, if I may say that. We have talked about this, the need of adoption of IPv6 for more than 10 years. As soon as it was becoming clear that we at some point would be running out of IPv4 addresses because the internet was such a smashing success that it grew so quickly that at some point we would run out. Obviously, a new protocol was made that is very similar to the old one. It's called IPv6. There's just this really gigantic number of addresses. This is something that needs to be deployed now, urgently, I'd say. We have been saying that for a long time. There are a couple of studies out, surveys on ISPs and their IPv6 readiness, as we might call it. Also at the RIPE NCC, we are surveying our own region for this. And we do see a significant increase in awareness. We talk to the internet operators regularly as the RARs, as the NRO also. We have lots of material out there that we spread around talking about this. We do see an increase in awareness. We do also see an increase in internet service providers, internet operators who know about this and who have done something, who have rolled out IPv6 already. However, that is a relatively small minority still, and seeing as we will hear from Elise that we will be running out of IPv4 addresses probably over the next year or so, you really need to do something if you are an ISP to be able to continue to hook up new customers, and obviously you want to grow your business. If you are not an ISP but an end customer, an end user, somebody running a web shop on the internet, you need to be on IPv6 because at some point you will be losing parts of the internet if you are not. And that means eyeballs, that means customers, in the end that means income to you. So it is important to go and talk to your ISP and request IPv6 services. If you are an ISP, go and roll out IPv6 as a core system. And yes, we have been giving out IPv6 addresses for a long time already. And there are lots of addresses. We are happy to continue.
So in addition to what Axel's just said, IPv6 is not really a service that customers see. It should be much like just moving from analog telephones to digital telephones. Customers may have needed a new kind of phone to connect to their infrastructure, but they didn't really know that it was because it's digital rather than analog. They didn't know, and you will have both running for a long time together. So from a customer perspective, part of the challenge of the transition, which has been ongoing for the last 10 years, is to make sure that you make it transparent to your invisible to your customers, that the customers don't notice a change in their service. So many of us here at the conference today are running IPv6 as our infrastructure, and our connections are over IPv6. You can't tell it. I can still surf the web just like everybody else. I can exchange email just like everybody else. The network works exactly the same. The technologists have done a very good job of making sure the equipment is in the right protocols and that they can coexist with IPv4. So what is really inherent is for the service providers and the ISPs to continue that either dual stack type of approach where you offer both the V4 and the V6 so that your customers, though, have no idea that it's happening. And yet you can expand your customer base, you can expand your reachability, and have the opportunity for introducing new services because there won't be the limitation of having a restriction on the number of addresses that are available to you as a service provider or business.
Here's a question from somebody online. What specifically are you doing to encourage governments and the business sector to move to IPv6?
Now, there's limited power that we have over governments so far. We hear questions from the governments who are quite concerned about their national economies. Of course, they are fully aware that quite a large amount of that is running over the Internet, is dependent on the Internet, and they hear that, oh, something is going to happen there. Now, it's important to say at this point maybe that the Internet will continue to run even when we run out of IPv4 addresses at IANA and at the RIRs. The deployed addresses keep deployed and the Internet will continue to run. So governments come to us and said, what should we do as governments? And we tell them there is a lot you can do in awareness building. You should talk about it. You should request services and equipment that you as a government deploy to be IPv6 ready. And that's about all you can really do as a government if you want to tread lightly.
One of the things I wanted to mention now that we're in Colombia is that the Colombian government has created a program called Viva Digital. And there are many parts of this program which is to expand the Internet and the technology within Colombia to support its economy and the growth of the economy. And a key part of that program is the deployment of IPv6 and the promotion of IPv6 within Colombia. And so I wanted to applaud the Colombian government on this great program that they've put in place and their acknowledgement of the fact that in order to be able to grow their technological expertise and their networking capabilities, that IPv6 is a component of that program.
With regard to businesses, that is something that we're doing right now. We build awareness, we talk to people, we ask the end users, we ask businesses to request IPv6 services from the ISP so that there is a little bit of a groundswell of business interest. Because the problem, and you might ask yourself, why aren't more people, why aren't more operators deploying IPv6? The ground problem there is, as Elisa has said, there is not much that the end customer really sees in change. There are no new features. So many of the ISPs say, well, this is not really important for us right now. In future, it will become important, then we'll do it, but right now we have other things to do. And the whole IPv6 deployment has been always a bit of, we'll do it when we have to. So we are saying, you will have to really soon now.
We have an online question. Which countries specifically are leading in IPv6 adoption?
Oh, gosh. I don't want to offend any country, but in the early stages, at least, of the earliest deployments, I would say, and I don't know, Axel, you may have a different impression, Japan was one of the earliest countries to really invest in this. And in that case, it really was a government initiative that worked with the academic and research communities and then with their private companies to build some IPv6 only networks within Japan. And so I think they were very much on the leading edge. There are some charts on the web that you can look at that show that most of the IPv6 deployments seem to be in the Asia-Pacific region or in the European region right now. And I think that Europe, I can't guess on a country, but there are an awful lot of activities within the European sphere in the IPv6 region. The U.S. government many years ago mandated that in order to sell to the U.S. government, you had to have equipment that was IPv6 capable. And so that did spur a lot of the development for vendors, particularly those vendors that support the infrastructure, that build routers and other equipment that are associated with telecommunications and data services, to buy equipment that was IPv6 capable. However, that didn't mean that those vendors and those companies had to deploy IPv6. It just meant that the equipment had to be capable. So governments have had different ways of encouraging the deployment of IPv6, and I hope I didn't offend any country that feels that they were in the forefront, but I think Japan was one of the very early ones, and Europe is now also has a lot of activity in this area.
Maybe I could add to that. From what we see in our statistics, and they are of course available on the website, we do see a really high number of requests for IPv6 addresses coming into the regional internet registries, specifically in Europe indeed. We also know that the really large countries in the world, and that certainly would be India, would be China, they know that with the growth of the network, they cannot satisfy the needs with IPv4. So quite early on, they have started great initiatives in deploying IPv6. Now, having said that, we do see large numbers of requests coming in, as for instance the RIPE NCC for Europe. That doesn't mean that those addresses are also visible on the network, that they are deployed already operationally, but obviously people are requesting them in preparation for some activity they might still have to undertake. So there is hope, and the reason again we are doing this today is to impress on you some urgency that the change will have to be made really soon. What will happen if people ignore the need? They will come at some point to the regional internet registries for more IPv4 addresses. In about a year from now, we will say, we are sorry, we don't have any for you anymore. You are certainly ready to do IPv6 now, aren't you? And then they'll say, oh no, we are not. Okay, now how do we do? What do we do? And then there will be a period of fear, uncertainty, doubt, some panic for those people who haven't been ahead and haven't done their homework at that time.
Well, this is a question from Monica Emmert in Europe, whom I'm assuming you know. What is IANA's current expectation in terms of when it will allocate the last block to the RIRs, or the last 5? And when does RIPE expect to run out?
Okay, so I'll answer for the IANA part of that question. And we have 7 blocks of IPv4 addresses right now that the IANA is holding for allocation. If I had a crystal ball, which I don't, but I'll pretend I have a crystal ball, I would expect that we would get the request for the next 2 allocations, which would leave 5 then for the global policy, sometime between now and the end of January of 2011. So that means sometime in January, there would be the trigger point to say, okay, we only have 5 blocks of IPv4 addresses left. It's now time to look at the global policy. We, the IANA, are in communication very closely with the NRO and the various regional registries it represents, talking about a coordinated distribution of those last 5, dependent on when the last 2 that I'm holding in my block that are not under the global policy are distributed. So looking in the crystal ball again, if I give out 2 by the end of January, I would say by sometime in early spring 2011, the last 5 would be allocated.
And as to your question, Monica, when will the RIPE NCC run out, or the regional registries? That is uncertain. We do some predictions based on previous activities, previous number of requests coming in, for instance. But that, of course, changes from week to week. So we might see some acceleration. Currently, we are not really seeing that yet. So my guess is at this point in time that the regional registries, the RIPE NCC in this case certainly, will run out of IPv4 addresses some point in the second half of next year. So that's, I know that's very rough, but that's as good as it gets today.
We have another online question. What is the cost of business? Bottom line, this is expensive, isn't it?
Not really. We assume that the equipment that is in place today in the core network is already capable of running IPv6. So this basically then is a question of switching IPv6 on, of designing your network accordingly, your IPv6 network. Basically, the cost is in manpower, in some training. It's not as difficult and as expensive as you might think. We have had reports from a couple of, let's say, early adopters who rolled out IPv6 over their core network, and they said the main fear was before we did it. Afterwards, we said it could have been much, much worse. We should have done it much earlier because it wasn't really worth that much fear.
So I think there are a couple costs that you need to consider. The one is the cost of starting to incrementally be prepared for the IPv6, and I think you can plan that just as you plan any sort of business expense, and you can leverage it over time because it's not like you're going to run into a brick wall tomorrow. You're going to have a period of time to plan this transition, and you can then plan your expense and your expenditures. If you decide to wait till you run into the brick wall, then it's going to be expensive, because then what you're going to really try to do is to try to upgrade lots of things all at the same time, and you're going to have a rather urgent transition plan or an interoperability plan, because you're going to want your V4 network to be able to talk to your V6 network. And so that's going to be more expensive. And at that point in time, then you run into your legacy support costs, because no one expects to rip out everything, all the equipment and the end users that are using V4 equipment right away. So it's really, you have a range of costs. You can spend a lot of money at the end by trying to have to do it in an urgent situation, and then also have to have the support and the costs for maintaining the parallel systems, the V4 and the V6. Or you can start now when it's less urgent and have incremental investments. And I think there are many service providers that have been wise like that and have started that way and have spread the costs across a few years. So it is expensive, but then the costs of not doing it are more expensive, in my opinion.
Elise, you seem to be saying this is the direction that it's going. You're going to spend money eventually. Spend now, it's less, more in the future. Is that too much of an oversimplification?
No, I don't think it's too much of an oversimplification, but it's kind of like buying something on layaway. I don't know if they still do that anymore, but you used to be able to go into a store, at least in the U.S., and if it was a big ticket item, you'd say, okay, I'm going to put down $25 this month and $25 next month, and eventually in a year I'll have paid for it. And so what I'm saying is, if you have a plan and you invest incrementally, it's less expensive than if you wait till the end when you have to have a massive capital investment.
We have another question from Monica in Europe. What kind of failures do you think end customers will see after V4 numbers run out? Will they understand what happens to them?
So I think the end user customers will probably not understand why they can't resolve and reach a certain server. Probably they won't know the word resolve unless they're involved in the industry. And so they'll call their customer support people. The customer support people will say, oh my, we have a connectivity problem. They probably won't blame it on IPv4 or IPv6. And some of the types of failures that it could have caused that are within the service provider themselves. They may not have done certain things for the DNS system that need to be done. So if you have IPv6 only customers, DNS has to have IPv6 glue. It's something that does a mapping, so I won't go into it in too much detail. But IPv4 glue exists today. It's a configuration. It's nothing special. You don't need new equipment, anything like that. It's a configuration parameter. So I think early deployments, when you have more more IPv6 users, it will show that some of these infrastructure things will not necessarily have been ready, and that configurations will have to be done by your technical staff to everything. You may find that there are only some servers that only support IPv4, and so there'll be some content that you only can get to with IPv4, and if you have an IPv6 address, the infrastructure people are going to have to either put in some sort of network address translation, so your IPv6 address can talk to this IPv4 only address. Or it could very well be that people will put two addresses on boxes that are offering services. There are not enough IPv4 addresses to put two addresses everywhere, but on services that people want to reach, for instance, Google Today, all of their servers, if you do anything www.google.com, you can get it to it either by v6 or by v4. So those kinds of services and infrastructure things have to be taken into account in the service provider or the content provider or the business's planning. And I'm going to go a little bit back to the costs and breakages and connect them. Some people think, for instance, if you have a business now that's running IPv4, that you're going to have to upgrade everything within the business. You really don't. You can continue to run your business internal network on IPv4. It's just the perimeter, the external part of your external facing network that would have to be in IPv6 to make it accessible to the rest of the world. So you don't have to upgrade everything. And today, IPv4 networks, businesses have requested a portion of the IPv4 address pool to be to be private. So we have reserved IPv4 addresses that are not routed globally. They're only used for internal private networks. So you could think of, going forward, that the entire IPv4 address pool could become private space for businesses. And it's only IPv6 that might be the externally facing part, and that could be one part of a transition. So I know I wandered around. I apologize.
My name is Sandra Hoferichter from Medienstadt Leipzig e.V., and I will here serve in ICANN as a future ALEC representative for Europe. My question is from an end-user perspective. You mentioned earlier that there will no other service and no changes for the end user. But what I have heard in various discussions with the technical community, that there are indeed some positive changes by using IPv6. Just let me give an example, and please correct me if I'm wrong. If you maybe buy a printer which is serving IPv6 addresses, might be able to do much more as a printer is able to do now. Maybe he might serve as a fax or something like this. Could you please tell us if this is right or if I'm wrong informed?
I would like to say that functionally IPv6 is very, very similar to IPv4. So a change like that I don't see coming. What we will see is an increased, the potential at least, for increased transparency in the network. Now what we see for many, many years, partially brought forward by the shortage of IPv4 addresses, is that many networks deployed network address translators. So where internally you can hide, in a way, your network to against the outside world by using such a device. So you use, as Lisa said, internally private address space, and you only show one address to the outside that is publicly visible. Now that will not be necessary with IPv6 because there are so many addresses. So in theory you can have every single device on your internal network be visible to the outside world if you so choose. So there might be functional improvements in that you can target your printer from the outside world much easier than you currently can't. I think that is something that I would agree that there could be some functional improvements.
Despite your calls, do you think we're going to end up in a situation where people won't act in time? What would happen in that case? How dramatic would the effect be?
I think it's going to be a lot like the Y2K situation, where people were worried that things were going to break. I'm sorry, Axel's looking at me like in question when we went from the 20th century to the 21st century. rolled over from 1999 to year 2000. So just like everyone, there was a lot of money for consultants for the last 2 years driving up to the year 2000. And I think it's going to really be a big time for consultants in IPv4 and IPv6. And I'm not one of the ones that really believe that there's going to be a total breakdown. There may be parts that need to be fixed, but I think they're fixable. And I think that I just don't think there's going to be a meltdown. Axel, how about you?
No meltdown. Yeah, that's why I looked at you a little bit funny from the side. I don't see this as a case of Y2K in functionality. No, the internet is not going to stop. We have a running internet today, and once we run out of numbers in your organization, in my organization, that doesn't change that we still have a running internet at the time. There might be problems, but those problems will be incremental, where we have added bits here and added bits there, and then a little bit of IPv6, a little bit of IPv4, and then there might be some small problems popping up that can be those can be solved. But it's not going to, oh my God, the internet isn't working anymore, kind of problem. No.
So, Axel, what you're saying is all those journalists who are online who've written the lead, internet about to collapse, have to rework that top of that story, right?
As long as it's just the top is fine, because it gets people to read it. And then you say, no, it's not as bad as you might think.
Here's another question from Monica in Europe. Let me see here. Has IANA a role to promote better IPv6 connection to Tier 1 operators that sometimes fail their downstream customers, as we heard at the RIPE meeting?
I think the IANA's role is to promote the evolution of the use of Internet numbers and protocol parameters, and the evolution of the domain name system and the universal connectivity and resolvability. So that's more of a promotion role than any other role, I think, at this point in time. And we are doing that by speaking in many venues, and not just as the IANA, but the ICANN Board of Directors speaks in this area. The ICANN executive team speaks in many areas. And then we have specialists within ICANN and the IANA that speak in various forums across the world in a promotional sense.
This is another one of those times when I'm going to take my prerogative as host and ask a question. I'm curious from both of you, when you travel, when you talk to people, as you are talking to these journalists today, what comes back at you? What sort of reception are you getting? Are people saying, wow, we didn't realize this. We didn't realize that this transition is on the horizon. What are you hearing?
I get more and more knowledge back that people are, or awareness, let's say, that folks are aware that something is going to happen. They have heard about it. They might not know the details, but something is going to happen, and that's talking about the general public. Looking at the network operators, they know. You must be a really tiny network operator tucked away somewhere behind the seven mountains in order to have missed this. Now we have, as Elisa started to say, we have these conferences all over the place. The network operators groups, they come and talk to each other for so many years already. We have started this whole track towards IPv6 more than 10 years ago. And over the last, let's say, 3 years, we do see a significant increase in awareness and in action as well. And as Monica has said, yes, there was a RIPE meeting recently where some problems were talked about. And that is exactly the role that those conferences play. People, ISPs, network operators need to exchange their experiences with the rollout of IPv6 and all other operational issues. And as long as they do that, they will find little errors, little mistakes, and then they can fix them, they can address that. And that's the benefit of communications and talking to each other, really.
I think I hear what you do, you get knowledge back. But lately I think some of the comments I hear the most are mostly about the cost and the concerns. And the concerns that even though the vendors of big infrastructure type stuff, like routers and switches, they're prepared. They've gone and implemented both protocols, IPv4 and IPv6. It's the equipment that's closer to the user that's the real worrisome piece for a lot of people, and how are they going to do that? So laptops are typically set up so they could be V4 or V6 capable. But then there's in-home routers that a lot of people have. Not all of those are capable of both protocol suites. And there's lots of equipment like that that's between the big service providers and the laptop that everybody's worried about. And how will those vendors catch up, and how do you get not the service providers but homeowners to maybe update their equipment so that it's more modern? And that, I think, is a more challenging issue. It's a little bit, at least in the U.S., we've switched from regular TV to HD TV now. And I was one of the slow adopters there. And so I was not beginning to get television stations and things like that until we had to go out and buy a new TV. So I think individual users are going to find at a certain point in time that they have a lot of legacy equipment, and those legacy vendors may or may not have kept up. And that's the concern I hear when I'm hearing people talk to me now.
And I think we have a question in the room from AFP.
Buenos días, mi nombre es César Sabogal de la Agencia Francesa de Prensa. Quiero reiterar una pregunta sobre costos del IPv6. Para una organización que comience, una organización incipiente o una institución que esté en el momento de decidir si empieza ya con el IPv4, con tecnología IPv4, o IPv6, que le resulta menos costoso. O sea, hacer la transición, esperarse a que esté totalmente implementado el IPv6 y esperarse, o de una vez comenzar con el IPv6.
So I would think if you're a greenfield, someone just starting your network, you would buy the equipment that is capable of both. And most of the equipment today supports both the V4 and the V6. And that allows you to have the interoperability for customers that won't be supporting V6 yet. And you'll be able to grow your services, your native services, on IPv6. So you can connect to both the V4 customers as well as the V6. And most equipment supports both today. And I would only select vendors that would support both.
Do you have anything to say in closing?
Basically, the story is, if you haven't deployed IPv6 now, you have about a year to do it without pain. Do it now.
I'd like to say that it's sort of like choosing between feast and famine. So you could decide to starve yourself and stay in the IPv4 world, or you could decide to go out and have a feast and have as much as you want, and you could eat as much as you want, because IPv6 has that many addresses available. And the Internet's all been about innovation. Everything that's happened in the last 25 years was totally unexpected. And if you choose famine, basically you're saying, okay, I think I'm going to stick with the status quo. I don't expect anything new to ever happen. Whereas if you go for feast, you've got the opportunity for that innovation.